Okay, this is a bit of orientation on a battery load tester. Sometimes they're called an AVR, which would be the amps, volts, and resistance tester, but this one doesn't really have a resistance test portion to it. We would rely on a digital multimeter or a DMM for that particular mode to do resistance checks. So this meter here, again, it's made by Autometer, and it can be used for a couple different things. One, checking the capacity of the battery. So does the battery have the ability to maintain a certain amount of voltage when a certain amount of current is drawn from it to allow the truck to start or the vehicle to start? The other thing it can be done with this particular unit is checking charging systems. So looking at some of the components that are attached to this tool. So here we have our inductive amp clamp, and it goes around a current carrying conductor. And it does have an orientation mark on it facing the positive or facing the ground. Depending on which way you connect this onto the truck or the battery will indicate up here on the screen whether you are negative or positive. Okay, so that will also help the technician create the correct orientation, whether you're connecting it on the positive side or the negative side. And really, if the charging system is functioning correctly, you should see very little difference between the positive or the negative side. So within this handheld amp clamp that is connected directly to the tool, there is also an adjuster in here that you press your finger on, and you can rotate it to zero the scale so that there is no value on the scale prior to doing the test. So it gives you the accuracy of the exact amount of current that is being checked, whether it's output from the alternator or whether it's load testing the battery and determining the rate of current based on the amount of voltage that's dropping. So the next part of this tool here is the heavy-duty leads, which are connected in parallel to the voltmeter. And then for the load bank inside here, which is a carbon pile, which is a bunch of plates that come together, and it creates a certain amount of resistance, which really, in a sense, shorts the battery out to cause more current flow to occur, and then we can read that on the meter. So these heavy-duty leads here are connected in parallel for the voltmeter portion, and then in series for the amp meter portion. And all amp meters are connected in series unless they're an inductive amp clamp, and all voltmeters are connected in parallel. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to connect it over onto the battery source right now so we can illuminate this unit so we can see. And you can see on the scale right here that the battery static voltage is 12.88 volts. So there is also an indicator over here that tells us how long we are doing that particular load test for. So right now our static battery voltage is 12.88, and we want to see a very minimum of 12.6 volts before we do any testing. If we're at 12.7 or 12.78, maybe even close to 12.8, you're probably going to be okay to test the battery. But you never test the battery when you're below a very minimum of 12.5 volts, because all charging system output values would be established as a maximum output at the minimum voltage, which you would see on the chassis, which is usually 12.5 to 12.6. Okay, so that would be loading the system down to its maximum at that, but nominally on chassis when they're running, we typically see any voltage ranges from maybe 13 to even upwards to 14.7, even up to close to 15 volts. So the unit also uses this dial here, and we can roll on a certain amount of load on the battery. And I don't have these batteries connected the way I'd like to at this particular point to do the test, but I'm just going to simulate this by putting the inductive amp clamp on that line, and it's showing that's negative here. If I adjusted that, and we'll just go back and adjust it here so you can see the movement. If I go in and adjust it, I can roll this thing around. You can see I can bring it up or down on this scale, And what I want to do is I want to get it as close to 0 as possible. And we'll leave it right there at that particular value. Okay. So sometimes it's kind of hard to get it zeroed right on, but you have to take a mental note that if you're not there, then you're going to add or take away this value that you see here. So that would be the technician's discretion on how you're doing that. And then you also have, as an additional portion to this meter, it has a function on it right here for volts. It talks about the volt scale, and it has an internal and has an external value. So when we're connected internally, we're hooked up to the meter and we're reading exactly what we're connected to on the battery source. And then when we go external, what we can do is we can put our jack plugs in, and then we can use these leads right here on external, and you see the scale goes to 0. And then if I make the connection onto the battery, then the scale will read, and you can see on this one here that I'm reading 12.88 volts, just like we had with the internal leads. So these leads are typically used for the function of doing on-chassis voltage drop tests. So you don't have to have an additional meter out to do those particular tests. So these tools, and then we switch this back to internal again. So this tool can be used for analyzing the charging system. It can be used to analyze the battery, and also for putting loads on the chassis to determine if we have voltage drops. Usually from the manufacturer, they give you a reference chart which talks about the state of charge of the batteries based on open cell battery, so a lead acid battery. It talks about how to make the connections on the clamp, pass or fail values that you would typically see when you're doing a battery load test. And then it tells you how to set the chassis up, disable the ignition so the truck or vehicle does not start, so we can do cranking tests if that's what the test is that we're happen to be doing. So there's a bunch of different ones we can do in here. It gives you directions and instructions to reinforce your test that you're going to be doing for alternator output tests, for example. So there's always some reference guide to make sure that you have some good instructions for doing the test, as well as a variation of different tests within that particular tool.